In 1968, a scientist built paradise. Unlimited food, unlimited water, no predators, no disease, no cold, no scarcity of any kind. He called it Universe 25, and he filled it with mice. At first, everything went exactly as expected. The mice reproduced, the population grew, the community flourished, and then, at the exact point where everything should have kept thriving, everything began to collapse. Not from lack of resources, not from disease, not from predators, but from something far stranger. Something that the scientist John B. Calhoun would later call the death of the spirit. And something that, once you understand it, you will not be able to stop seeing in the world around you. John B. Calhoun was an ethologist at the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States. He wasn't a philosopher, he wasn't a visionary, he was a scientist who built cages and measured behavior. He spent more than 20 years designing experiments on population density in rodents, studying what happens to social animals when they have everything they need but too little space. His early experiments in the 1950s had already shown something disturbing. When rats had limited space but unlimited resources, they didn't simply organize more efficiently. They developed what Calhoun called a behavioral sink, a progressive, systematic degradation of the most complex social behaviors. But Universe 25 was different. In Universe 25, there was plenty of space. And yet it collapsed anyway. The design of Universe 25 was deliberately generous. A box approximately 6 feet by 6 feet, divided into interconnected tunnels and nesting areas. Theoretical capacity for 3,840 mice. Food and water available at all times, in quantities that would never run out. Perfect temperature, no predators, no external threats. Calhoun introduced 4 pairs of mice, 8 animals, and began to observe. The first phase was what he called the adjustment phase. The mice explored, established territories, and began to reproduce. The second phase was the boom. The population grew exponentially. By day 315, there were 620 mice. Everything seemed fine, but at that point, something began that Calhoun had not fully predicted. Although there was physical space for thousands more animals, the mice began to cluster. The central zones of the box became overcrowded. The peripheral tunnels, a perfectly habitable Shana, were almost empty. Social density was high, even though physical density was not. And that social density changed everything. The first thing to collapse was social structure. In a normal mouse colony, dominant males establish and defend territories. They protect females. They raise the young. They resolve conflicts. In Universe 25, that system broke down. Dominant males became hyper-violent, attacking males, females, and young indiscriminately. Non-dominant males withdrew completely. They stopped trying to reproduce. They stopped interacting socially. They limited themselves to eating, sleeping, and grooming. Calhoun called them the beautiful ones. They were physically perfect. Their coats were immaculate because they spent hours grooming themselves with nothing else to do. They had no scars from fighting because they never fought. They showed no signs of stress because they had opted out of every aspect of social life. And they were completely useless to the survival of the colony. They didn't defend. They didn't reproduce. They didn't raise young. They simply existed. Females, meanwhile, began to fail at raising their young. They abandoned pups before they could survive on their own. Some became aggressive toward their own offspring. The most complex behavior, the kind that required investment, care, relationship, disappeared first. The population peaked around day 560, approximately 2,200 mice. And then, with no change in available resources, no disease, no predators, the population began to decline. First slowly, then with accelerating speed. Birth rates collapsed. Pups that were born weren't properly cared for. Young that survived didn't learn the social behaviors they needed because there were no functionally healthy adults to teach them. Calhoun called it the second kind of death. Not biological death, but the death of complex social behavior. The mice were still alive, still eating, still drinking, but they had ceased to be a functioning society. On May 23, 1973, the last mouse in Universe 25 died. The colony had gone completely extinct. Not from lack of resources, but from the inability of individuals to assume the complex social roles necessary for the species to continue. Calhoun spent the rest of his life trying to understand what he had observed. His conclusion was disturbing. The problem wasn't physical overpopulation. The problem was social overpopulation. Too many social stimuli, too many interactions, too much demand on the cognitive and emotional systems of the animals to process the social world they lived in. When a social environment becomes too complex for the brain to handle, social organisms don't simply adapt. They withdraw. They simplify. They reduce their participation to the minimum required to stay alive. And in doing so, they abandon exactly the behaviors that make the continuation of the species possible. Calhoun published his findings in 1962 and 1973. Both publications caused a sensation, not because scientists agreed that mice predicted human behavior. They don't. But because the description of what happened to the mice sounded like something many people were already starting to feel in their own lives. In 2023, the World Health Organization officially declared loneliness a global health epidemic. Not a metaphor, a public health crisis. In the same year, a report from the U.S. Surgeon General documented that more than 50% of American adults report measurable levels of loneliness. Despite being more technologically connected than at any other point in history, birth rates in the world's most developed countries have fallen below replacement level for the first time in recorded history. Young people in Japan, South Korea, and increasingly in Europe and North America report having consciously chosen not to form romantic relationships, not to have children, and to minimize their social participation. In Japan, there is even a term for this: herbivore men. Men who have voluntarily chosen to withdraw from social and romantic competition. Nobody is forcing them. There is no scarcity of resources. There is only a density of social stimuli, pressures, and demands that the human nervous system was not built to process, and a response that seems increasingly rational. Withdraw, simplify, reduce. We are not saying that humans are mice. We are not saying that the collapse of Universe 25 is the inevitable destiny of civilization. Human systems are incomparably more complex. Culture, language, technology, consciousness. These are variables that Calhoun's mice did not have. But there is a question that the experiment raises, and that has not found a satisfactory answer in 50 years, that deserves attention. What happens to a social species when the environment it has built exceeds the capacity of its individuals to participate in it meaningfully? It won't collapse from hunger. It won't collapse from disease. It will collapse from withdrawal. From the silent accumulation of millions of perfectly rational individual decisions to simplify, reduce, withdraw, and not participate. Calhoun's beautiful mice were not sick. They were responding exactly as a rational organism would respond to an environment that had exceeded its capacity to process. The question is not whether you are responding the same way. The question is how much of that response is inevitable, and how much you can still choose.